So we've been looking at the Catholic Church primarily over the last number of weeks as it became established in the Roman Empire as the state religion of Rome. And we saw the power emerging together with the state, the power of the church institutionalized. So you have a hierarchy of authority that goes up to the Pope, and you have this organization of cardinals and bishops and priests, and so it's all being managed and controlled from Rome. And then you have a split. You remember that we talked about that last week, the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's more of a political and geographical split, but there are some doctrinal issues that are associated with it. That transubstantiation, that issue, that means the Catholic Church to this day teaches that the priests, when they have the Mass, transform the bread and the fruit of the vine into the actual body and blood of Jesus, and that confers grace upon the recipients. And that idea of grace being delivered from the top down, so to speak. If you want God's grace, you've got to go through the church. The church is God's vehicle through whom he distributes all of his grace. And so you have sacraments that the Catholic Church identified, 7 sacraments through which God's grace would be conferred upon the masses, and you have to go through the church to get God's grace. So you have this political institution that is also a religious institution, and at times it's very dominant, at times it's very weak, but always there's corruption in the hierarchy. And you're going to see that if I emailed out something for you to read, a lot more information than we can cover this morning. But you'll see as you read through that information that what's going on in the Catholic Church is immorality and what they call simony, buying the office of a power and authority. You have corruption and power being demonstrated from top down. And people are starting to wake up, so to speak, in the 1200s. You have the Enlightenment. You have people becoming aware that they can contribute something to society. And so you have the rise of the humanities. You have art, you have scholarship, education, you have men and women waking up, so to speak. And the Renaissance begins. And so men become more independent in their thinking, and there's more power, so to speak, in the populace than ever before. And so men are rising up during this period of time, 1250 to 1500, and they are protesting the power and authority of the Catholic Church. They're protesting the immorality and ungodliness of the leadership in the Catholic Church. And so you have these stories that are written, and we have very little information compared probably to what we could have had it not been suppressed by the Catholic Church, but we have evidence of a number of different uprisings, so to speak. And as I read through this, Philip Schaff has a set of books called The History of the Christian Church. I have it back in my library. I think it's 6 or 7 volumes. And it's so incredibly detailed in terms of what information is actually available to us historically. And I was reading through a lot of the stories of the uprisings and the protests and the men and the women who are urging the Catholic Church to change and to stop the corruption and stop the power and stop the immorality and stop, dominating like they were politically. And it's just fascinating to see how many of those kind of stories exist out there of men and women who were aware and who were trying to oppose and trying to get back to what some semblance of Christianity that they knew was not right in terms of what was going on. So I wanted to read a couple of things to you from this handout. There's so much good information in here. I'd like to read it all to you, but I'll give you a little bit of the background information. The authoritative and traditional ways of the Roman Catholic system held back the progress of society in nearly every sphere. The Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, Unless the church blessed an endeavor, it seldom got off the ground. Even the educated were schooled in only the most formal and traditional ways. Stress was on what was, not what could be or should be. With the Renaissance came the rebirth of culture, the wider worldview introduced by the Crusades, the Arabic scholars in Spain who were acquainted with classical literature and math, and the influx of Greek scholars from Constantinople who fled from the Muslims all set the stage for reforms. Genius flowed in all directions. The sciences, algebra, geometry, history, literature, languages, arts. Especially important in religion was the study of the scriptures in their original languages, Hebrew and Greek. The corrupted Latin Vulgate, which was the only translation they really had all this time, would be no longer the authority. This all fueled the humanist movement, the idea that man should live for man and see what man could do. When you hear the word humanism, that's the basic idea. Man is the measure of all things. We live for man, we elevate man, we think that we are wise and smart enough to figure everything out. That's humanism. And so this all fueled the humanist movement, the idea that man should live for man and see what man could do. Some saw this as man alone, while others kept God in mind. So you had religious humanists. You had humanists who were thinking the same way of elevating man, but they were also including God in their practice, in their teaching. And so, in a sense, they were elevating themselves above God and declaring themselves to be religious. Part of humanism was the idea that every man had potential. This radical idea eradicated the need for the oppressive medieval ecclesiastical apparatus. Some were Christian in their humanism, others were strictly secular. Then the literature goes on to talk about what's going on in Italy, what's going on in Germany, what's going on in England, and you have all these opposition forces rising up and being put down by the powers that be, but nevertheless rising up. You have men such as John Wycliffe. You might be familiar with that name. He's one of the more famous names of what we would call the pre-Reformation time frame. That's what we're really dealing with here in the late medieval era. It's right before Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in Germany, 1517. So this period of time is leading up to that. And so Martin Luther usually gets credit for starting the Protestant Reformation, and rightly so to some degree, but there were a lot of men and women before Martin Luther who were rising up and calling for reforms in the Catholic Church. John Wycliffe was one of them. He was from England, actually translated the Bible into English. William Tyndale is usually given credit for the first real English version, but John Wycliffe actually should get the credit for that. So he lived in the 1300s. He never got persecuted in the sense of killed, I guess you'd say, like some of the other Protestant reformers did. He was a professor, and he taught in a number of different schools. He taught at Oxford, and he was very vocal in his opposition to the popes. During this time, there was tremendous immorality amongst the leadership in the Catholic Church. There was a period of time in which there were 3 popes in the 1400s because 2 of them refused to resign. And so when they appointed the 3rd one, it ended up being 3 popes instead of 1. And so there's all this going on. So the Catholic Church power is kind of weakening as men become more aware that they have human potential and they're elevating the arts and humanities and knowledge and so forth. And so let me go through some of the slides I have here. A lot of this I've already kind of made reference to, so I'll go kind of quickly through this. The rise of nationalism is interesting because you have all these different areas of Europe that are very much seeing themselves as independent from the Roman Empire. They're very self-sufficient. And so they have their own culture and their own way of living. And so you have these opposition groups arising within these different nations. I showed you this last time. No way to really understand all of this and describe it in a way other than just to show that there was an overlap of popes at times in history. We talked about the Renaissance, humanism. The Renaissance spirit, as knowledge grew, fear decreased. Men thought less of worshiping the unknown and more of overcoming it. See, that's that idea of humanism. We can be in charge. We can figure things out. We can, manage without God. So less fear of the unknown and more of the idea of overcoming it. And I mentioned that there are Renaissance humanists and religionists. So you have some who are humanists without God at all in their thinking, and then some who are, including God in their thinking. But nevertheless, the idea of humanism is very predominant during the Renaissance period. There was an emphasis on the literal interpretation of Scripture. I have, let me see if I have that here. I guess I don't. Thought I did. I have a picture of a man. I'm trying to remember his name. That's why I was looking for the picture. There. Oh, it's at the bottom. It's not a picture. It's just the man's name. Nicholas of Lyra. I did a little research on Nicholas of Lyra, French monk, very prolific writer. Actually wrote the first full Bible commentary. And he approached the scriptures literally instead of there was all this mysticism in regard to interpretation of the Bible. People would come up with fanciful theories and ideas and pictures and visions and make Bible into stories and myths. And so this man looked at the Bible and said, we're going to translate it accurately and we're going to look at it literally. And he wrote his Bible commentary in regard to that. So Martin Luther actually was very heavily influenced by the commentary that Nicholas Lyra wrote. And I thought he was worthy of pointing out there. Textual criticism, love for scientific investigation, individualism, all characteristics of the Renaissance period. Then in 1446, you have the spread of the written word because of the invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg in Germany, 1446. Luther said printing is God's latest and best work to spread the true religion throughout the world. The Crusades had opened up trade routes, allowing paper to arrive. And so you have this idea of the whole civilized world becoming more knowledgeable, more able to study for themselves, more able to think for themselves, and less oppressed by the powers that be. They're not willing to stay under the power of the Catholic Church and the Roman Empire. So that's what's leading up to Martin Luther. There's a picture. I don't know how to explain how they did all that, but it must have been pretty cool to see the first printing press produce mass copies. And keep in mind that mass copies is an overstatement, no doubt. But nevertheless, it was very helpful. These are some men that I did a lot of research on. Peter de Bry's, 1076 to 1131. So you see, this is really going on long before Martin Luther. The I don't know how to say it right, Petrobrusians were a group of people that followed after Peter de Bry, who was opposed to the Catholic Church power and authority. And there were a number of different doctrinal arguments that Peter de Bry would make against the Catholic Church. Infant baptism, for example. He read the scriptures. He was a knowledgeable man, priest, and he read the scriptures, and he said, how can we have infant baptism when Jesus said, he who believes and is baptized will be saved? And so he began to argue for believers' baptism. And he argued against transubstantiation, which I already mentioned. He thought that was a mystical concept that nowhere taught in the scriptures, and it is a mystical concept. Peter Waldo, in 1140 to 1218, the Waldenses are a very well-known historical group that came out of that period of time. And not everything that these groups stood for and taught, I believe, were biblical or accurate. There was a lot of mixture of truth and error, but there was more truth in their opposition than there was error. Their opposition was based on their reading of the Bible and seeing how that contrasted with what the Catholic Church was practicing and teaching. And then I already mentioned John Wycliffe. The Lollards, I looked that up. That word actually means the mumblers. And it was used in a derogatory way. It stuck. And so John Wycliffe's followers, after he died, were known as the Lollards, the mumblers. And that was a derogatory term given to them because they were teaching and saying things that were in opposition to the Catholic Church. So they would theoretically, as the story goes, talk softly because they didn't want anybody to persecute them. So they were called the Lollards or the mumblers. John Huss was very much influenced by John Wycliffe, and his followers continued in opposition. He was actually burned at the stake. The Catholic Church excommunicated him, and he went off into exile. And then a few years later, the Pope called him back to Rome to listen. He said, "We want to hear what you have to say in your dissent." And that was a lie and a deception. They captured him and they burned him at the stake. So, stories like that are shocking in a way, but they were not terribly uncommon in this kind of political power structure that was based in Catholicism. So most people don't know about the history of Catholicism down through the centuries. It's not something that's taught, except maybe in some university classes and so on. And I'm very confident that I would venture to, if I had to put a percentage on it, I'd say 99% of all Catholics are unaware, really, of the history of Catholicism down through the centuries. Usually, anytime it's brought up like this, there is a justification made that goes something like this, that the church is infallible. And the Pope, when he's sitting on his chair proclaiming God's teaching, is infallible, but men are fallible. And so it's just excused. It's just kind of shoved off into a corner. All of the immorality, all of the ungodliness, all of the deceit, all of the power and everything is just kind of shoved off by saying, well, men are fallible, but the church is not. So that's how that's handled. All right, I'll take a breath. Any comments? Questions? Yes, Antonella?
Yeah, so they had a lot of persecution during the emperors. So what I don't understand, I guess this is a question, is I hear that a lot of things that the Catholic Church did was more like the emperor. The emperor thought that they were lords, they were God.
Right.
But if they got sick, they'd say, this is something from the gods. They didn't know the true God until, the Christians, when they were scattered, and they, the other emperor, what was his name?
Yeah, what you're describing, Antonella, is exactly right. Is you have this power structure that has been created that merged church and state, as we like to call it. the power, the political power and the religious power were merged together. And so that became the dominant power and authority over all of mankind.
But that came later though, right? At first, when they had the church,
Right.
They were,
Persecuted, right? Christians were persecuted.
by the emperor.
That's
Now,
right.
when they had the church.
That's
when they
right.
met, they're saying, if you look up where the Catholic, where did the Catholic Church originated? It says at Antioch.
Right. Well, the Catholic Church has their story, okay? And they say, here's how it all happened, and they have their popes coming from Peter and so on. But historically, none of that is validated. Absolutely none of it.
Well, why is it history then?
It's their history.
Oh, well.
And whoever's in power gets to write the history. Okay, who's ever in power gets to write the history. So that's what I was saying. There's a lot of history that we probably will never know about of people in opposition to the power and authority of the Catholic Church down through the centuries. But what we do have is historical information about how church and state did merge together and did dominate and did exert their authority. And so, Christianity, quote unquote, was really just Catholicism. It was an organized church and state power structure that combined so-called Christianity with political power. And that's just fact. There's just no denying the history of that. And so no matter how the Catholic Church may want to write the history, we know the history. And we know that, for example, Lucian, I think, is declared to be the second pope after Peter. A real person, he was, historically, but no information whatsoever that there was ever anything called a pope. And so in the 400s, you had men. So we're talking about now 350 years after Lucius. Now in the 400s, you have men declaring themselves to be the Pope. And then in 606 AD, you have the first officially recognized universal bishop called the Pope, Boniface III. It wasn't until 606 AD that the whole civilized world recognized a Pope. So that's history. That's true. That's fact. So Lucius was not the second pope. He was never called a pope. There was no such thing as a pope. Nobody was ever called a pope until really the 400s, and even then, not until 606 was there one universally recognized.
Jerry?
Yes, Bert?
Because of the autonomous nature of local churches, the local churches are just interested in carrying out the work of the church locally.
Right.
There's no, local churches didn't have the view of, we need to preserve this for posterity's sake. We need to write this down. Occasionally there's somebody that, off to the side that wrote a memoir, wrote a diary
Right.
that can be discovered that was hopefully unbiased. But, that wasn't, God never gave that mission to the church. Therefore, there is no church historian. Therefore, there's lots of information that gets to be revised
Right.
by whoever comes after. So these revisionists come back and rewrite their concept of what they wish history could have been to suit where they actually wound up in error.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be that way because it's not the church's job to record their own history.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's been on my mind as well, to make sure that I keep emphasizing that fundamental truth, that what we're really reading is the history of an organization that has no right to exist scripturally and biblically. So, we shouldn't be surprised when we get their information. And what Bert is describing is all these groups of people out there. We don't know what they were doing. We don't know what they were practicing. We just have little hints of all of these little pockets of people who were trying to do what was right. and try to go back to the scriptures. And that's the period of time that we're in now, and as in our study, is this period in which men and women are doing that way more. There's an interest in the original biblical languages. There's an interest in translating the Bible, and then the printing press gets invented, and now we can produce mass copies of the Bible, and people can start reading it for themselves. And so we're in that transition point, and it's not surprising that men and women in large masses are realizing the corruptions and the errors of the religious organization that dominates the world. And so that's,
I got a question.
yeah, right?
Basically, the printing press, if it's not the truth, and all this time it's been a lie, they printed this lie, and then got people believing this big lie, all right? And then you got the Bible over here, and what people are believing this lie that been printed, and then the Bible still here, people are still trying to bring the truth toward this lie. You
Mhm.
know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's just hard, you know? When you really understand, try to understand what's going on, it's like, it's hard. Now it's like, okay, Catholic, all right? No, I'm not a Catholic. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe God sent His Son, you
Right.
know? I want to be a Christian. You
Right.
know what I'm saying?
That's what people are starting to
Yeah.
think like.
And
Yeah.
then my history is this right here. Is God sent His Son to me for my sin, for the whole world, for their sin. You know, that should be our history, all right? Let's go with that.
Yeah.
And that should be like,
And-
now everybody else's history is trying to line up with God's history, but they're putting a lie into it.
Sure.
It's crazy.
It's
It doesn't
it,
make
it's
any
it, it's going on today. It's been going on forever. That's the devil's work when you think about it. If you want to look at it from a simplistic standpoint, it's nevertheless true that the devil is the father of lies, that Satan is called the god of this world because he produces or is the author of all of the lies that men in their own free will perpetuate. And so we have lies and truth. And so now truth is starting to be read more and more and more, especially because of the invention of the printing press. And so there's this battle, like you're describing. There's a battle going on between truth and lies. And men and women are starting to become more aware and have more access to the truth which God provides through the scriptures. So it's a pretty exciting time, really, when you think about it. And yet it was not too exciting for John Huss, who got burned at the stake. All right, so you have a persecuting church. Will Durant is a historian. This is simply his perspective. He says, compared with the persecution of heresy by the Roman Catholic Church, the persecution of Christians by pagan Rome was a mild and humane procedure. No one would have ever called the persecutions of the early church mild and humane. And so he's drawing an exaggeration here. He's trying to show you just how bad the persecutions of the Catholic Church were upon those who opposed them during this period of time. So you had corrupt leadership, materialistic greed, sensuality. You had one pope during this time, I can't remember his name, in the 1400s, who was an outright blatant humanist who didn't believe in God, and he was pope. I mean, how does that happen? So you know that there is a weakening going on in the Catholic Church power structure, and men and women are starting to rise up. So there are doctrines that the Catholic Church, I'm going to go through a few of the doctrines that the Catholic Church taught that are blatantly false doctrines. The veneration of Mary. Not till 431 was Mary given the title Mother of God. She was soon viewed as a mediator, interceding with the Son for mercy on sinners. So I do believe that you can you can say that there was a merging of pagan thought with Christian thought in the adoption of Mary as an object or a person of veneration and worship. Elevating Mary to the position of mediatrix is what one pope called her, the mediatrix. She jointly mediates with Jesus, and so pray to Mary, and Mary will take your prayer to Jesus, and then you'll be forgiven of your sins through Jesus. So Mary becomes co-mediator with Jesus. She's called the Queen of Heaven in the 1200s. You can see that's a very pagan concept, the Queen of Heaven. And then certain doctrines such as the Immaculate Conception, not till 1854 was it declared that Mary had never had sex and so on. And yet the Bible talks about Mary having many children, Jesus having brothers and sisters. And so it's just an effort to try to elevate Mary into a position that can be worshiped. And so to this day, even though the Catholic Church will quibble about whether or not they actually are advocating worship to Mary, in all practicality, that's exactly what they're doing. They're advocating that people should worship Mary. And her title, Mother of God, places her on an equal level as the Son of God. So that's one of the more striking doctrines that came out of Catholicism. Her perpetual virginity, the Assumption of Mary, 1950. So new doctrines, new teachings are coming as recently as 1950 about Mary, that she was taken up bodily into heaven just like Jesus was. So again, trying to put Mary on a par level. In 2005, Pope John Paul II referred to Mary as co-redemptrix, or as cooperator in the redemption. These are all unbiblical, anti-biblical teachings and doctrines. Here's the 7 sacraments that I mentioned earlier. And, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses, we'll talk about that next week when we get into Luther. Much of what he wrote was his effort to try to reform the Catholic Church. He was a Catholic priest, and he didn't want to go back all the way to the scriptures per se and do everything exactly the way the scriptures taught. He just wanted to reform what he saw as corruptions in the Catholic Church. One of those corruptions was this idea of the treasury of merits. It's again that idea that all of the grace that you're going to receive from God has to come through the church. And so these 7 sacraments are set up by the Catholic Church in order to impart God's grace. So you have to go through the priesthood to get the grace of God. So if you want to get married, God's holy institution of marriage, you need a priest to marry you, and that's called the sacrament of holy matrimony, because you have to have the blessing of the church in order for your marriage to be blessed. Confirmation is simply the idea of coming of age. At age 12, boys will be confirmed. I was confirmed. I was raised Catholic, and I was confirmed at age 12. And you take on a what they call a Christian name. So they give you a book of all the saints, and I really enjoyed reading all the stories of all these saints, so-called saints, people that they've elevated to sainthood and that you pray to, and you again receive God's help through these saints. And so you're supposed to pick a saint, and then that's your new Christian name. So I remember picking, my saint was Sebastian, because he had 7 arrows in his chest. I thought at age 12, I thought, well, that's pretty cool. And because he lived, he had 7 arrows in his chest and he lived. That's the man I want to be, And so, unfortunately for Sebastian, after he lived from that event, a couple of years later, they shot another 7 arrows into his chest and he died that time. But these are ideas that kind of glue you to the Catholic Church. You're infant baptized, and so you become a member of the Catholic Church at infancy. You're confirmed at age 12. Now you're a bona fide adult, so to speak, Catholic. Extreme unction is really the idea of last rites. You've probably heard that term. Last rites is so when someone's dying, they call for the priest, and the priest prays over them, and that way that they can go to heaven, or in their doctrine, go to purgatory for a while and then go to heaven. Another doctrine, I didn't have it up on the board, false doctrine of purgatory, where they teach that people go for a temporal punishment. A temporal punishment. So everybody who dies, goes to purgatory, except for the babies. The babies go into limbo. They have another place called limbo for the babies, because babies haven't done anything wrong, so let's put them in a different place. We don't want them to suffer at all. And so that's called limbo. And purgatory is where you suffer for a time because of your sins. So some people will suffer for a long time because they were really bad people, but eventually they'll get to heaven. They just need to suffer for a time in purgatory. So what that did was that allowed the Catholic Church then to come up with a practice called indulgences, where they would sell people forgiveness of sins so that they could get their family or their friends out of purgatory sooner. So that was very appealing to people. If they believed that teaching of purgatory, it was very appealing to them to then take their money and give it to the Catholic priest so that they could get their family out of purgatory sooner. So again, this is the kind of corruptions that are going on in the Catholic Church that men like John Wycliffe and John Huss and others are objecting to. And finally, Martin Luther in 1517 has had enough. And his focus was very much on the idea of this selling forgiveness of sins, this treasury of merits, this, God giving you grace based upon your works. So and we'll talk about that more next week. We only got a few minutes left this morning. But Martin Luther's concept of the Catholic Church's teaching that works are what saved you led him to an extreme position on works that was in error, I believe. And so all of that was based upon the Catholic Church's emphasis on works. You can work your way, so to speak, to heaven. And the more works that you do, or the more money that you give, then the less time you have to suffer in purgatory. Very much works oriented. And so I think that's what led up to Martin Luther's opposition. Questions, comments?
I do have one more. The church in Italy, the Catholic Church is not the same as it is in the United States. You know that, right? They don't function the same.
Yeah, there's differences.
Yeah, I was looking where the booth, to go and confess my sins. It wasn't there when I came to the United States. I said, where do you go before you get your communion?
Yeah.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
So that was different. I thought,
yeah.
Okay. And
there's
a lot of things I think that they have.
Oh yeah, there's been so many changes down through the centuries because
Exactly.
remember the teaching of the Catholic Church is that their tradition is equal to the authority of the Scriptures. We haven't talked about that in a while, but that's the position that they took very early on, is that the Church's traditions are now equally authoritative so they have the right to change things as they go. And so you'll see that sometimes. You'll see proclamations coming down from the Pope that are different from previous proclamations because they have the right to change things according to the authority of the Church. I remember it was always a scary thing for me. I would have to go into that little closet you know, in the church building, into the confessional. Yeah. Yes, Ellie?
You can pay for anything in the Catholic Church. You pay to be baptized, you pay to be confirmed,
Yeah.
you have blessings, you pray when you die, they can say a mass for you, but everything you have to pay for. It's
Right.
not, it's a gift.
That's right. And this is what's been going on for centuries, you know, and men and women are starting to wake up to that in this period of time, and they're saying this idea of indulgences especially is so objectionable and so,
You have to pay to be baptized.
yeah, and pay to be forgiven of your sins, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yes.
Isn't that kind of, that shows the proof that they don't follow the Bible, because the Bible never changes, the Bible's
Right.
the same as it was when it was originally written, so for them to say, well, we can change what we want, or the Pope to say, I'm gonna change this, that's not biblical, because you're not keeping with what the Bible says.
Right. Well, what they say is that the Bible is not sufficient.
Right.
So they will add what they believe. They think God is telling them to add these things to the teaching of the church. They'll add. And whether it's in the Bible or not doesn't matter to them. Yeah, Mike?
How many indulgences do you have to buy to get out first? Is there like a cap?
You know, I'm not really, I didn't live through that time, so I don't know. But I'm sure the really bad people needed a lot of money. All right, so all these abuses are going on. You have nepotism, simony, I already mentioned, is the purchasing of office, purchasing of power. I want to be archbishop. Okay, here's my money. Make me archbishop. There's a more detailed discussion of indulgences, but this really was the thing that in 1513 to 1521, Pope Leo X revived the Jubilee indulgence, purporting to use all revenues to fight the Turks in the East. You know, again, as Christians, we scratch our head, you know, the church is fighting wars? Yeah, all through history, the Catholic Church was involved in the fighting of wars. But in this case, he was using the money to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, not to fight the wars that he said he was going to do. All right, so I think that's actually a copy of a letter of indulgence. There's Vatican City. And that brings us to next week when we'll talk about Martin Luther and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation.